At the dawn of the 19th century, the world lived under the shadow of an indisputable truth. Great Britain ruled the waves. The Royal Navy was not merely a military force. It was an institution that had ground the navies of France, Spain, and the Netherlands into dust over the course of centuries. From the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588 to the annihilation of the combined French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar in 1805, British naval supremacy had been proven again and again in fire and blood. The Royal Navy possessed over 900 warships and 150,000 trained sailors. Its officers were raised from childhood in a tradition of victory so complete, so absolute, that they had difficulty imagining defeat. British confidence was not arrogance. It was the logical conclusion of 200 years of unbroken dominance. A British frigate was superior to any equivalent vessel from any other nation on Earth. Everyone knew this. It was simply a fact of life, as unchangeable as the tides themselves. But on the other side of the Atlantic, a young republic, born of revolution, and still searching for its identity, was about to challenge this natural order of things. What happened in the waters of the North Atlantic during the War of 1812 would shock the world, humiliate the masters of the sea, and give birth to a legend that endures to this day. A legend of a ship whose sides seem made of iron. A legend of American sailors who proved, against all expectations, that they could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest navy on Earth and emerge victorious. This is the story of Old Ironsides. To understand how this legend began, we must first understand how desperate and vulnerable the young American Republic truly was. After the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress, exhausted by years of conflict and desperate to reduce expenses, made the fateful decision to disband the Continental Navy entirely. By 1785, the United States of America, a nation born in war against the greatest naval power on Earth, found itself without a single warship to protect its interests. American merchant vessels sailed the oceans completely defenseless, at the mercy of any nation powerful enough to prey upon them. And prey upon them they did. In the Mediterranean Sea, the Barbary pirates of North Africa had long terrorized European shipping, capturing vessels and enslaving their crews for ransom. The great powers of Europe paid tribute to these corsairs, purchasing safety for their merchants with gold. But the United States, newly independent and stripped of British naval protection, had no such arrangement. American merchant ships sailing Mediterranean waters became easy targets. The situation became critical in 1793 alone, when 11 American ships were captured by Algerian corsairs, their crews enslaved, and their cargo held for ransom. The humiliation was intolerable for a proud young nation, but without a navy, there was nothing to be done except pay the ransoms demanded by the pirates and endure the shame. This disgraceful situation could not endure forever. In 1794, Congress finally acted, passing the Naval Act that authorized the construction of 6 frigates to form the nucleus of a new United States Navy. However, the nation's hesitancy was written into the law itself. The act included a clause stating that construction would be halted immediately if peace terms were agreed to with Algiers. The young republic was not yet certain it wanted a permanent navy at all. It was under these precarious conditions that a legend began to take shape. The third of these ships had her keel laid down on November 1st, 1794, at Edmund Hart's shipyard in the north end of Boston, Massachusetts. The name Constitution was personally selected by President George Washington from a list of 10 possible names presented by Secretary of War Timothy Pickering. But it was her designer, a brilliant Philadelphia Quaker shipbuilder named Joshua Humphreys, who ensured she would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. Humphreys' design philosophy was revolutionary for the time. He understood that the fledgling United States could never match the European powers in the sheer size of their navies. Therefore, his ships had to be individually superior. They had to be designed to overpower any other frigate afloat while possessing the speed to escape from a ship of the line if necessary. To achieve this seemingly impossible goal, Humphreys created frigates that were deeper, longer on the keel, and narrower of beam than any European equivalent. Most critically, the design called for what Humphreys termed diagonal riders, massive structural braces running through the hull that were intended to restrict what shipwrights called hogging and sagging, the tendency of a ship's hull to bend and flex under its own weight over time. This revolutionary structural innovation allowed the ship to carry extremely heavy planking without compromising her sailing qualities. The construction of Constitution was a monumental effort of logistics and labor, supervised by Captain Samuel Nicholson, Master Shipwright Colonel George Claghorn, and Foreman Prince Athern. The hull was built to a staggering 21 inches thick, far heavier than any European frigate of comparable size. Her length between perpendiculars was 175 feet, with a length overall of 204 feet. Her beam measured 43 feet and 6 inches across. In total, approximately 60 acres of forest were required for her creation. The primary materials consisted of pine and oak, but the most important timber came from a very specific source: the incredibly dense southern live oak harvested from Gascoigne Bluff and milled near St. Simon's Island in Georgia. This live oak was unlike any other shipbuilding material in the world. It was extraordinarily dense, so heavy that it would sink in water rather than float. It was nearly twice as strong as the white oak used by European shipbuilders. Working with it was a nightmare for the shipwrights. The wood was so hard that it shattered tools and exhausted the strongest men. But the result would be a hull of unprecedented strength, a wooden wall that could absorb punishment that would splinter and shatter lesser vessels. The British would learn this lesson in the most painful way possible. History must also acknowledge the hands that felled this remarkable timber. Enslaved workers were used to harvest the live oak used for the ship's construction. As USS Constitution Museum historian Carl Herzog has stated, the forced labor of enslaved people was an expediency that Navy officials and contractors saw as fundamental to the job. Enslaved people were essential to the construction of naval warships built to secure the very American freedoms they were denied. It is a bitter irony that a ship destined to become a symbol of American liberty was built in part by those who were denied that liberty themselves. The birth of Constitution was nearly aborted before she could ever touch the water. In March 1796, a peace accord was announced between the United States and Algiers. In accordance with the termination clause written into the Naval Act of 1794, all construction was immediately halted. The shipyards fell silent. The half-completed hull sat idle on the ways, monuments to an abandoned project. It took intense debate and persistent prompting by President Washington himself before Congress finally agreed to continue funding, and even then, only for the three ships nearest to completion: United States, Constellation, and Constitution. Even her entry into the water proved to be a battle. On September 20th, 1797, during a grand launching ceremony attended by President John Adams and Massachusetts Governor Increase Sumner, Constitution refused to move. She slid down the launching ways only 27 feet before stopping dead. Her immense weight, greater than any frigate previously built in America, had caused the wooden ways to settle into the soft ground. A second attempt 2 days later gained only another 31 feet. It took an entire month of rebuilding the ways with stronger materials before Constitution finally slipped into the waters of Boston Harbor on October 21st, 1797. Captain James Sever christened her by breaking a bottle of Madeira wine across her bowsprit. She had been stubborn from birth, refusing to do anything easily. It was a quality that would serve her well in the battles to come. She was born heavy, stubborn, and tough. But a hull of oak, no matter how thick, is nothing without the teeth to bite. Officially, Constitution was rated as a 44-gun frigate. This rating, however, was deliberately deceptive. She routinely carried more than 50 guns at a time, and sometimes as many as 56. It is crucial to understand that ships of this era did not have permanently installed batteries of weapons like modern naval vessels. The cannons were designed to be completely portable and were frequently exchanged between ships as situations warranted. The philosophy of her armament was fluid and adaptable. Each commanding officer outfitted the ship's guns according to his own preferences, taking into consideration factors such as the overall weight of stores, the complement of personnel aboard, and the planned routes to be sailed. Consequently, the armaments changed often during her long career, and detailed records of every change were not always kept. However, we know her terrifying potential. In a letter dated November 14, 1804, she is listed as carrying 30 24-pounders, 14 12-pounders, and 8 32-pounder carronades, for a total of 52 guns. By the time the War of 1812 arrived, her loadout had been optimized for maximum lethality in frigate combat. Constitution's main battery typically consisted of 30 long 24-pounder cannons with 15 mounted on each side of the gun deck. These were her sniper rifles, weapons capable of long-range accuracy and devastating penetrating power. The 24-pound iron balls they fired could smash through the hull of an enemy ship at distances where lighter guns would barely scratch the paint. Above, on the spar deck, 22 more guns were deployed, 11 on each side, each a short 32-pounder carronade. These weapons were known as smashers, designed for close-range brutality. A carronade could not match the range of a long gun, but at distances under 400 yards, its massive 32-pound balls could cause catastrophic damage, shattering timbers and sweeping decks clear of men. Additionally, 4 chase guns were positioned, 2 at the stern and 2 at the bow, to destroy the rigging of fleeing or pursuing enemies. The total broadside weight of Constitution, meaning the combined weight of all the iron she could hurl at an enemy in a single volley, exceeded 700 pounds. A typical British frigate of the period could manage barely 500 pounds. This advantage in weight of metal would prove decisive in the battles to come. While the Barbary threat had sparked her creation, far larger forces were reshaping the world. The French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars plunged Europe into chaos, and the effects rippled across the Atlantic to the young American Republic. The British Crown, locked in a life-or-death struggle against Napoleon, refused to accept the commercial rise of its former colony. British policy toward American shipping became increasingly aggressive and humiliating. The Royal Navy stopped American merchant ships on the high seas and impressed sailors from their decks, forcibly conscripting any man they claimed as a British subject into His Majesty's service. Sometimes these men were indeed British-born. Often they were not. American citizenship meant nothing to a British boarding party in need of trained sailors. The British also maintained forts on American soil in the Great Lakes region, in violation of treaty obligations. They were suspected of providing weapons and encouragement to Native American tribes resisting American westward expansion, and British trade restrictions strangled American commerce, favoring British merchants at American expense. The accumulation of grievances finally became intolerable. The massacre at Fort Dearborn on August 15, 1812, served as the final straw. On June 18, 1812, President James Madison signed the Declaration of War. The United States of America was once again at war with Great Britain. By any rational calculation, it was madness. The disparity in naval strength between the two nations was almost beyond comprehension. Britain had 900 warships. America had 17. The Royal Navy had 150,000 trained sailors. The United States Navy had perhaps 5,000. The British had decades of unbroken victory at sea, a tradition of naval supremacy so complete that their officers simply assumed they would sweep the upstart Americans from the oceans within weeks. British newspapers greeted the declaration of war with mockery and contempt. One editorial dismissed the American Navy as nothing more than a few fur-built frigates, manned by a handful of bastards and outlaws. The destruction of this pathetic force, they assured their readers, would be swift, complete, and utterly humiliating for the former colony that had dared to challenge the mistress of the seas. They would not be laughing for long. The USS Constitution was already a veteran warship by the time war was declared. She had served in the undeclared quasi-war against France, protecting American merchant shipping from French privateers in the Caribbean. She had bombarded the fortresses of the Barbary pirates during the First Barbary War, helping to end the shameful tribute payments that had drained American coffers and stained American honor. But she had never faced the true masters of the sea in single combat. She had never tested herself against a frigate of the Royal Navy. In July 1812, Constitution, now under the command of Captain Isaac Hull, was cruising off the coast of New Jersey when her lookout spotted sails on the horizon. As the light improved, the true horror of the situation became clear. Those sails belonged not to one ship, but to 5. It was a British squadron from Halifax, Nova Scotia, commanded by Captain Philip Bowes Veerbroek of HMS Shannon. The hunters had found their prey. Constitution was alone, outnumbered 5-1, facing some of the finest frigates in the Royal Navy. Any one of those ships would be a dangerous opponent. Together, they represented certain destruction. Captain Hull faced an impossible choice. He could not fight. Even the magnificent Constitution could not defeat 5 enemy warships. He could not surrender. The honor of the young American Navy, not yet tested in battle, could not endure such a disgrace before the war had even properly begun. There was only one option left. He had to run. What followed was one of the most harrowing and remarkable chases in the history of naval warfare. An agonizing pursuit that lasted for nearly 3 days and covered hundreds of miles of open ocean. When the wind died to barely a whisper, leaving the ships becalmed and drifting on the glassy swells, Hull ordered his men to lower the ship's boats and row. Teams of exhausted sailors hauled at the oars hour after hour, towing the massive 1,576-ton frigate through the water at an agonizing crawl. When even that was not enough, Hull resorted to a technique called kedging. Anchors were loaded into boats, rowed far ahead of the ship, and dropped to the ocean floor. Then the entire crew hauled on the anchor cables with every ounce of their remaining strength, dragging Constitution forward a few hundred yards. The anchor would be raised, rowed ahead again, dropped again, and the backbreaking process repeated over and over, hour after hour, through the burning heat of July. The British, watching this extraordinary display of American determination, adopted the same tactics. For 3 days and 3 nights, more than 57 hours in total, both sides pushed their crews to the very edge of human endurance. Sailors collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. Men who had been awake for more than 2 days continued to pull at ropes and oars with bleeding hands and trembling muscles. The British ships crept closer, then fell back, then closed again. It was a race measured in yards and inches, with no room for error and no possibility of rest. On the 3rd day, Hull spotted a squall line forming on the distant horizon. He made a desperate gamble, setting every sail Constitution possessed and racing for the approaching storm. He reached it first. The rain and wind that blinded and scattered the British squadron filled Constitution's sails and carried her to safety. After more than 57 hours of continuous pursuit, the chase was over. The Royal Navy had failed to catch her. But Isaac Hull was not content with mere escape. He had not fled the British to hide in port. He wanted revenge. He wanted to prove that American sailors could do more than run from their British pursuers. He wanted a fight. On August 2nd, 1812, Hull brought Constitution into Boston Harbor just long enough to resupply his ship and give his exhausted crew a brief rest. He did not wait for orders from Washington. He knew that British squadrons were gathering to blockade American ports. and he had no intention of being trapped like a rat in a hole. Without orders, without permission, Hull sailed Constitution out of Boston and headed east into the Atlantic, hunting for British merchantmen and any British warship foolish enough to face him alone. On August 19, 1812, Constitution was cruising approximately 600 miles east of Boston when her lookout spotted a sail on the horizon. Hull ordered his ship to close and investigate. As the distance narrowed over the following hours, the identity of the stranger became unmistakably clear. She was a frigate, and she was flying the Union Jack of Great Britain. She was HMS Guerriere. Guerriere was a captured French vessel, originally built for the French Navy and taken by the British in 1806. She was a fifth-rate frigate mounting 38 guns, including a main battery of 18-pounders. She had been part of the squadron that had chased Constitution just 1 month earlier, but now she was alone, sailing toward Halifax to make much-needed repairs to her rigging. Her captain was James Richard Dacres, a confident and experienced officer from a distinguished naval family. Dacres knew the reputation of Constitution. He knew that the American frigate was larger, carried heavier guns, and had a larger crew. Constitution displaced 2,200 tons and carried a crew of 480 men. Guerriere displaced only about 1,560 tons and had a crew of just 272. Constitution's broadside weight was 754 pounds of iron. Guerriere was only 526 pounds. By any objective measure, Constitution was the superior ship. But Captain Dacres was not concerned. He was a British naval officer, heir to a tradition of victory that stretched back through Nelson at Trafalgar and the Nile, through Rodney at the Saints, through Hawke at Quiberon Bay. British frigates did not lose to anyone. The Royal Navy had proven this truth time and again against every nation that dared challenge its supremacy. Just 13 years earlier, HMS Sybil, a 38-gun frigate armed with 18-pounders identical to Guerriere's armament, had captured the French frigate La Forte, which carried 42 guns including 24-pounders. If a British frigate could defeat a larger, more heavily armed French opponent, surely Guerriere could defeat this untested American ship crewed by amateurs and commanded by officers who had never faced the Royal Navy in real battle. British superiority was not merely in ships and guns, it was in blood and breeding and 2 centuries of unbroken triumph. Dacres was so confident of victory that he made a gesture of contempt toward the American sailors serving in his own crew. Several of Guerriere's men had been impressed from American merchant vessels, forced into British service against their will. Dacres, not wishing these men to be compelled to fight against their own countrymen, allowed them to go below and take no part in the coming battle. He then cleared his ship for action and prepared to meet the oncoming American frigate with the calm assurance of a man who had never known defeat. The 2 ships began maneuvering for position shortly after 4 in the afternoon. The sea was rough, with heavy swells running, making accurate gunnery difficult at long range. Guerriere opened fire first, hoping to damage Constitution's rigging and slow her approach. Her shots fell short or flew wide, splashing harmlessly into the churning sea. Constitution continued to close, her gun crew standing ready at their stations, matches lit and ready, waiting for the order to fire. Captain Hull was determined to get as close as possible before unleashing his broadside. He knew that at close range, his heavier 24-pounder guns would be devastating against Guerriere's lighter construction. He also knew that the rough seas would make long-range fire largely ineffective for both sides. Better to close the distance and make every shot count, the range close to 500 yards. Guerriere fired again, and again her shots fell short or missed entirely. Constitution continued her approach without returning fire. 400 yards. Still Hull waited, pacing the quarterdeck with apparent calm while his crew grew increasingly restless. His men begged permission to return fire. Not yet, Hull told them. 300 yards. British shot was now beginning to strike Constitution's hull, thumping into the thick live oak planking. Still Hull held his fire. The crew was frantic with anticipation, desperate to strike back at the enemy. 200 yards. Finally, at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, with the 2 ships just 25 yards apart, so close that the muzzle flashes of one ship could singe the paint of the other, Hull gave the order his men had been waiting for. In a voice that carried across the gun deck, he roared, "Now, boys, pour it into them." Constitution's first broadside was apocalyptic. 30 24-pound iron balls smashed into Guerriere's hull simultaneously, accompanied by a storm of grape shot and canister that swept her decks. The American gun crews, drilled relentlessly by Hull during the weeks at sea, reloaded with mechanical precision and fired again, and again, and again. The rate of fire was devastating, far faster than the British had anticipated from an untested enemy. The effect on the lighter British frigate was catastrophic. Joshua Humphreys' engineering, that massive 21-inch thick hull supported by diagonal riders and built from the densest timber on the North American continent, was about to shock the world. British gunners, trained for speed and precision, struck Constitution's hull with their 18-pound balls. But instead of shattered timber and death, pure physics took over. The dense live oak planking, backed by those revolutionary diagonal riders, absorbed the impact. British cannonballs that would have punched clean through any European frigate struck Constitution's sides and bounced away, deflected by wood so dense, so hard, so unyielding that it might as well have been solid metal. An American crewman, watching in astonishment as an 18-pound shot hit the ship's flank and fell harmlessly into the sea as if it had struck solid rock, shouted the words that would echo through eternity. "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron." The nickname Old Ironsides was born in that moment, christened in smoke and thunder, baptized by enemy fire. While British cannonballs ricocheted harmlessly from Constitution's oak walls, the American response was tearing Guerriere apart. The heavy 24-pound balls smashed through Guerriere's lighter French-built hull as if it were made of paper. Within 15 minutes of that first devastating broadside, Guerriere's mizzenmast, the rearmost of her three masts, gave way at 6:05 p.m. and came crashing down, dragging a tangle of rigging and canvas into the sea. The drag of the wreckage slowed the British ship and made her almost impossible to maneuver effectively. Hull, seeing his enemy crippled, maneuvered Constitution to deliver more punishment. The ship swung close together, and Guerriere's long bowsprit, the spar projecting forward from her bow, became entangled in Constitution's mizzen rigging. For several desperate minutes, the two ships were locked together in a deadly embrace, grinding against each other in the heavy swells. With the ships almost touching, the battle became intensely personal. Marines on both sides opened fire with muskets, pouring lead across the narrow gap between the vessels. Officers on both ships were hit. Captain Hull himself was wounded by a musket ball, though not seriously enough to force him from the deck. Captain Dacres took a wound that left him bleeding on his own quarterdeck, but refused to leave his post. Both captains ordered boarding parties to assemble. On Constitution, American sailors and Marines gathered with cutlasses and pistols and boarding axes, ready to storm across Guerriere's bowsprit and carry the fight onto the enemy's deck in brutal hand-to-hand combat. On Guerriere, British sailors prepared to do the same. But the sea was rough, and the ships heaved and rolled unpredictably in the heavy swells. Each time a boarding party prepared to cross, the vessels lurched apart, opening a churning gap of deadly water between them. Any man who attempted to leap across would have been crushed between the hulls or drowned in the thrashing sea. Neither side could board. In the chaos of close combat, with the ships still locked together, Guerriere's crew fired directly into Constitution's stern cabin, the captain's quarters at the rear of the ship. The shots started a fire aboard the American frigate. For a terrifying moment, it seemed that Constitution might be consumed by flames. A fire aboard a wooden warship packed with gunpowder was the nightmare every sailor dreaded most. But Constitution's crew reacted with extraordinary speed and discipline, extinguishing the blaze before it could spread to the magazines. And then at approximately 6:20 in the evening, with a sound like the crack of doom, Guerriere's foremast and mainmast came crashing down. The main topmast fell first, followed moments later by the entire mainmast and foremast together. All three of her masts were now gone. She was what sailors called a hulk, a dismasted wreck rolling helplessly in the swells, unable to maneuver, unable to fight, unable to do anything but await her fate. Constitution pulled away from the wreck of Guerriere at approximately 6:23 p.m. to repair the damage to her own rigging. Despite the intensity of the close-range battle, Constitution's damage was remarkably light. Her crew worked with frantic efficiency, splicing severed lines and replacing damaged sails. By 6:45, less than half an hour after breaking contact, Constitution was once again fully operational and ready to resume the fight if necessary. But there would be no resumption. As Constitution approached the drifting hulk of Guerriere, it became clear that the British frigate was finished. She was a shattered wreck, rolling so heavily in the swells that water poured through her gun ports. Her masts were gone. Her hull was pierced in dozens of places. She was taking on water faster than her pumps could possibly remove it. Hull sent a boat across to the British ship. When the American lieutenant climbed aboard and asked if Guerriere was prepared to surrender, Captain Dacres, bleeding from his wounds and surrounded by the carnage of his shattered deck, replied with the dark humor of a man who had lost everything. "Well, sir, I do not know. We have lost our flag. There was no flag left to strike. It had gone over the side with the masts. Dacres was brought aboard Constitution as a prisoner. In a gesture of respect and chivalry that would be remembered on both sides of the Atlantic, Captain Hull refused to accept Dacres' offered sword, the traditional symbol of surrender. "No, no," Hull said. "I will not take a sword from one who knows so well how to use it." It was a gracious acknowledgement of a gallant enemy, a recognition that Dacres had fought with courage and skill even in a hopeless cause. The aftermath of the battle revealed just how one-sided the engagement had truly been. HMS Guerriere had suffered 15 killed, 78 wounded, and 257 taken prisoner, her entire surviving crew. The ship herself was so badly damaged that Hull judged her impossible to save. She had 5 feet of water in her hold, her masts were gone, her hull was shot through in countless places, and she was settling deeper into the water with every passing hour. Constitution, by contrast, had lost only 7 killed and 7 wounded. Her hull was barely scratched. Those magnificent live oak sides had done exactly what Joshua Humphreys had promised they would do nearly 2 decades earlier. British 18-pound shot that would have shattered any European frigate had bounced off Constitution's flanks like pebbles thrown against a castle wall. The British prisoners were transferred to Constitution. The wounded were treated with care and respect. The officers were given quarters appropriate to their rank. Captain Dacres himself, in his official letter after the battle, praised Captain Hull and his officers for their treatment of the British prisoners. "The greatest care was taken," Dacres wrote, "to prevent our losing the smallest trifle. It was a gracious acknowledgement from a defeated enemy, a recognition that the Americans had conducted themselves with honor." On the morning of August 20th, 1812, with all prisoners safely aboard Constitution, Guerriere was set ablaze. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, her magazines exploded, and she disappeared beneath the waves, taking with her the myth of British invincibility. News of the battle traveled slowly in 1812. There was no telegraph, no radio, no instant communication of any kind. It took weeks for the reports to reach Boston, and longer still to cross the Atlantic to London. But when the news finally arrived, the reactions on both sides were profound and lasting. In America, the victory ignited an explosion of patriotic joy unlike anything the young nation had experienced. The early months of the war had brought nothing but humiliation and disaster. American armies had been defeated on land and driven back in disgrace. The confident predictions that Canada would fall within weeks had proven to be delusional fantasies. The war on land was going badly, and American morale was at its lowest ebb. And then came Constitution. Here at last was proof that American arms could triumph against the mightiest nation on earth. Here was evidence that American sailors and American ships were the equal of any in the world. Captain Isaac Hull became an instant national hero, his name spoken with reverence in every tavern and meeting hall across the nation. Congress awarded him a gold medal. Songs were written in his honor. Poems celebrated his victory. The defeat of Guerriere became a symbol of American determination, American ingenuity, and American potential. In Britain, the reaction was shock, disbelief, and a profound reassessment of American naval capabilities. The Times of London, which had so recently mocked the American Navy as a collection of fur-built frigates, now struck a very different tone. "It is not merely that an English frigate has been taken," the paper wrote with evident dismay, "but that it has been taken by a new enemy, an enemy unaccustomed to such triumphs, and likely to be rendered insolent and confident by them." They were entirely correct to be concerned. Constitution was far from finished. Some British commentators attempted to dismiss the defeat of Guerriere as a fluke, an unfortunate anomaly that reflected nothing about the relative quality of British and American seamen. Guerriere, they pointed out defensively, was an old ship, a captured French prize that had seen hard service. Captain Dacres had been unlucky. The American frigate had been unfairly larger and more heavily armed. In a fair fight between truly equal vessels, British courage and British skill would surely prevail as they always had. This comfortable delusion did not survive the winter. On December 29, 1812, just 4 months after the destruction of Guerriere, Constitution encountered another British frigate off the coast of Brazil. Constitution was now under the command of Captain William Bainbridge, an experienced officer determined to add to the ship's growing legend. The British ship was HMS Java, a 38-gun frigate considered one of the finest in the Royal Navy. Her captain was Henry Lambert, a skilled and aggressive officer with an excellent reputation. The battle between Constitution and Java was fierce and closely contested. Captain Lambert was killed during the engagement, shot down on his own quarterdeck. But the result was essentially identical to the destruction of Guerriere. After a furious fight, Java was dismasted and battered into a helpless wreck. She was so badly damaged that she could not be saved and was burned by her American captors. Constitution had done it again. The claim that Guerriere had been an aberration, an unlucky exception to the rule of British supremacy, was now impossible to sustain. 2 British frigates had faced Old Ironsides in single combat. 2 British frigates had been utterly destroyed. The pattern of American frigate victories continued throughout the war, each one adding to the growing legend of American naval prowess and deepening the shock felt by the British establishment. The USS United States captured HMS Macedonian in October 1812. The USS Hornet sank HMS Peacock in just 15 minutes in February 1813. Each victory seemed more improbable than the last. For the first time in living memory, orders went out from the British Admiralty instructing Royal Navy captains to avoid single ship engagements with the heavy American frigates. The hunters had become the hunted. The masters of the sea had learned to fear American oak. But Constitution's most remarkable action was still to come. If the victory over Guerriere had proven Constitution's brute strength and endurance, the Battle of February 1815 would prove the tactical genius of her commanders. After spending much of 1813 in dry dock undergoing an extensive overhaul, and most of 1814 blockaded in Boston Harbor by British warships. Constitution finally broke free late in 1814. A powerful westerly gale blew the British blockading squadron off station, and Constitution slipped out to sea under the command of Captain Charles Stewart. Stewart was a brilliant officer, aggressive and innovative, determined to add his own chapter to the legend of Old Ironsides. He took a ship across the Atlantic on a commerce-raiding cruise that carried Constitution to Bermuda, to Madeira, to the coast of Portugal, and finally back toward Madeira. And it was there, on February 20th, 1815, that Constitution would face her most complex tactical challenge. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Constitution's lookout spotted 2 sails to the south. Stewart immediately set all sail in chase, running before an easterly wind. As the distance closed over the following hours, the identity of the 2 ships became clear. They were HMS Cyane, a 6th-rate post ship mounting 34 guns under the command of Captain Gordon Thomas Falcon, and HMS Levant, a ship sloop mounting 21 guns under the command of Captain the Honorable George Douglas. The tactical situation was extraordinarily dangerous. Neither British ship was a match for Constitution in single combat, but together their combined force presented a serious threat. Cyane carried 22 32-pounder carronades, 10 18-pounder carronades, and 2 12-pounder long guns. Levant carried 18 32-pounder carronades, 2 6-pounder long guns, and a shifting 12-pounder. The combined crews of the 2 British vessels totaled 310 men. Constitution carried her standard heavy array of 30 long 24-pounders and 22 32-pounder carronades, with a crew of about 450 men after having earlier detached 20 men to a prize. Her broadside weight was 716 pounds. The combined broadside weight of the 2 British ships was slightly heavier at approximately 762 pounds. Engaging 2 ships simultaneously was considered tactical suicide by the naval theorists of the day. The 2 enemies could split the larger frigate's attention, maneuvering to catch her in a deadly crossfire and rake her from both bow and stern simultaneously. Constitution might defeat one opponent, but the other could use that time to position herself for a devastating attack. The sensible course of action was to retreat, to use Constitution's speed to escape before the British ships could coordinate their tactics. But Charles Stewart was not a sensible man. He was a fighting captain in command of the finest frigate in the world. He did not retreat. The 2 British captains saw Constitution bearing down on them and made their own decision. They would stand and fight together rather than split up and try to escape separately. At first they tried to delay the battle until after nightfall, hoping that darkness would give them an advantage, but Constitution was approaching too rapidly. They formed on the starboard tack in a line of battle, with Levant positioned about a cable's length ahead of Cyane, ready to receive the American attack. At 6:10 in the evening, the action commenced. Constitution approached from the northeast, holding the weather gauge, with Levant on her port bow and Cyane on her port quarter. The range at the start of the engagement was approximately 250 yards. At this distance, Constitution's main deck battery of 24-pounder long guns had a decisive advantage. The British ships were armed primarily with short-range carronades, weapons that were murderously effective at close quarters but nearly useless at the range at which the battle commenced. Constitution's long guns could smash into the British ships at distances where the British carronades could not effectively reach her. For 15 minutes, the 3 ships exchanged broadsides in a roaring tempest of smoke and flame. The gunfire was so intense, the clouds of black powder smoke so thick, that a dense bank of smoke gathered under Constitution's lee, completely obscuring the British ships from view. Stewart, unable to see his opponents and uncertain of their positions and condition, ordered his crew to cease firing. As the wind slowly cleared the smoke away, Stewart saw that the tactical situation had changed dramatically. Constitution had drifted abreast of Levant, the leading British ship, but Cyane had fallen back and was now attempting to cross Constitution's stern to deliver a raking broadside, the most devastating attack possible in Age of Sail combat. A rake could send shot tearing down the entire length of an enemy's deck, dismounting guns, killing crews, and destroying the ability to fight. It was in this moment that Captain Charles Stewart executed a maneuver that would enter naval history books and be studied by naval officers for generations to come. Instead of turning the ship slowly, which would have taken precious minutes and allowed Cyane to complete her deadly maneuver, Stewart ordered the sails to be thrown aback. He commanded his crew to brace the yards around so that the wind pressed against the front of the sails rather than the back. The effect was extraordinary. The force of the wind against the canvas abruptly stopped the forward motion of the massive 576-ton frigate and forced her to move backward, gathering sternway. It was an incredibly difficult and dangerous maneuver to execute under fire, requiring perfect coordination between officers and crew, split-second timing, and absolute confidence in the ship and her handling qualities. Done poorly, it could have left Constitution wallowing helplessly between her 2 opponents. Done well, it was devastating. Stewart did it perfectly. Constitution gathered sternway, sliding backward through the water, frustrating Cyane's firing angle completely. Instead of receiving a rake, Constitution delivered one. Her broadside smashed into Cyane's exposed bow, sending shot tearing down the length of the British ship's deck. At almost the same moment, Levant tried to take advantage of the situation by crossing Constitution's bow to deliver her own rig. Stewart, anticipating this possibility, immediately ordered the sails filled again. Constitution surged forward, and instead of receiving a rake, she delivered one to Levant, her broadside smashing into the British sloop's vulnerable stern and destroying her rigging. Stewart's crew manned both sides of the ship simultaneously, ready to fire in any direction as their captain maneuvered his vessel with surgical precision among the two enemy ships. As Levant drifted downwind with her rigging in ruins, unable to maneuver effectively, Stewart turned his full attention back to Cyane. The British frigate was already badly damaged, her masts tottering, her hull pierced by dozens of American shot, her decks slick with blood. At 6:50 in the evening, just 40 minutes after the battle began, Cyane struck her colors and surrendered. Constitution's second lieutenant, Lieutenant Hoffman, led a boarding party to take possession of the British ship. He found a scene of utter devastation. 5 feet of water flooded Cyane's hold. Her masts were on the verge of complete collapse, held upright only by the unusual calmness of the sea that evening. Her deck was covered with dead and dying men. 12 had been killed outright and 26 wounded, many of whom would later die of their injuries. But the battle was not over. Levant was still at large, limping away to the northeast under what remained of her battered rigging. At 8 o'clock, with Cyane secured and a prize crew aboard, Stewart set off in pursuit of the surviving British ship. What happened next demonstrated the extraordinary courage, or perhaps the ignorance, of Levant's captain, George Douglas. At 8:50, Stewart's lookouts reported that Levant was not fleeing. She was beating back upwind toward Constitution, her battle flag still flying, returning to resume the fight. Captain Douglas was unaware that Cyane had surrendered. He believed his fellow British ship was still engaged in the battle, and he was returning to her aid like a good officer should. The two ships passed on opposite tacks at close range, exchanging broadsides as they swept past each other. Douglas then attempted to escape upwind, hoping his lighter ship might work to windward faster than the heavy American frigate. For an hour, Levant fled and Constitution pursued, Constitution's bow chasers firing repeatedly into Levant's already damaged stern and rigging. At 9:30 in the evening, with Constitution closing rapidly and Levant's ability to maneuver virtually destroyed, Captain Douglas finally struck his colors and surrendered. The entire engagement, from the first broadside to Levant's surrender, had lasted approximately 3.5 hours. The actual fighting had occupied only about 45 minutes. In that brief span of time, Constitution had defeated 2 enemy warships simultaneously, a feat that would have seemed impossible to any naval theorist in the world. Captain Stewart's ship handling had been, in the words of one British officer at the subsequent court-martial, faultless. The casualties told the complete story of the engagement. Constitution lost just 4 men killed and 11 wounded. Her hull was barely damaged. She had lost only her fore topgallant yard, a minor spar that was easily replaced. As Constitution's chaplain, A.Y. Humphreys, recorded in his personal journal, she was in better condition to fight another battle after the engagement than she had been before it commenced. The 2 British ships, by contrast, were shattered. Cyane had 12 killed and 26 wounded, many of whom later died of their injuries. Levant had 7 killed and 16 wounded. According to British officers at the subsequent court-martial, the men of Levant twice abandoned their guns and fled below decks during the battle, driven from their stations by the murderous accuracy of Constitution's fire. They had to be driven back to their posts by their officers with threats and blows. Chaplain Humphreys described Levant's deck as a perfect slaughterhouse, her hull drilled repeatedly by American shot. But the most remarkable aspect of the Battle of Cyane and Levant was one that neither Stewart nor his crew could have known at the time. The War of 1812 was already over. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the conflict between the United States and Great Britain, had been ratified by the American Senate on February 17, 1815, 3 days before Constitution fought her final battle of the war. The news simply had not reached the combatants. They fought and bled and died for a war that had already ended. Constitution did not learn of the peace until April 28, 1815, more than 2 months after her final victory. By then, she had already experienced one more remarkable adventure, one final proof of her ability to escape from any trap. After the battle, Stewart sailed his little squadron of 3 ships to Porto Praya in the Cape Verde Islands, neutral Portuguese territory, to make repairs and arrange for the release of his prisoners. The 3 vessels anchored in the harbor on March 10th. Stewart was preparing to send the British prisoners ashore on a neutral cartel when a large ship was sighted approaching the anchorage. It was not 1 ship, but 3. They were HMS Leander, HMS Newcastle, and HMS Acasta, the squadron of Captain Sir George Collier. This was the same commander whose squadron had been blockading Boston when Constitution escaped. Collier had pursued Constitution across the Atlantic And now, at last, he had caught up with her. Leander and Newcastle were powerful 50-gun frigates, specifically constructed in 1813 with 24-pounder main deck batteries designed expressly to match the heavy American frigates that had humiliated the Royal Navy. Acasta mounted 40 guns. Together, the three British ships vastly outgunned Constitution and her two battered prizes. There could be no thought of resistance. Constitution might defeat one of these ships, perhaps even two, but not all three. This was overwhelming force, and Stewart knew it. He also knew that the Portuguese authorities would be unable or unwilling to enforce their neutrality against three British warships. If he stayed in the harbor, he would be trapped. His only chance was to run. Stewart made an instant decision. He ordered all three ships to cut their anchor cables and flee the harbor immediately. Constitution slipped out to sea, cutting away the boats she had been towing to gain every possible fraction of speed. The British squadron gave chase. Cyane, commanded by a prize crew under one of Constitution's officers, fell back as the pursuit continued. Then, in a moment of quick thinking, she suddenly tacked, heading in an entirely different direction from Constitution. Collier's frigates ignored her, focusing all their attention on the main prize. Cyane escaped and eventually reached New York without further incident. But Levant, commanded by Lieutenant Ballard, Constitution's first lieutenant, also fell back and could not keep pace. Unable to escape and apparently hoping that Portuguese neutrality might yet protect him, Ballard turned back toward Porto Praya. It did not help. All three British frigates pursued Levant into the neutral harbor and opened fire without regard for Portuguese sovereignty. British prisoners from Cyane and Levant who were being held ashore seized a Portuguese shore battery and also opened fire on the American-held ship. Facing impossible odds, Lieutenant Ballard struck his colors and surrendered. Constitution, however, made good her escape. Once again, she had slipped through the fingers of a superior British force. Once again, she remained undefeated. The Portuguese later paid compensation to the United States for their failure to enforce their neutrality during the recapture of Levant. And Captain Sir George Collier, the British commander, who had failed twice to catch Constitution, who had allowed her to escape from under his guns at Porto Praya with overwhelming force at his command, was accused of cowardice and incompetence. Unable to endure the dishonor, haunted by his failure to stop the American frigate that had humiliated his navy, Collier took his own life in 1824. In the entire War of 1812, USS Constitution was never defeated. She fought 5 major engagements against British warships and won all 5. She captured HMS Guerriere, HMS Java, HMS Pictou, HMS Cyane, and HMS Levant. She seized numerous merchant ships. She escaped from superior forces on multiple occasions using speed, skill, and the determination of her crews to slip away when fighting was impossible. She became, in the eyes of the American people, the living symbol of American naval prowess and American determination. But the story of Old Ironsides did not end with the War of 1812. Her subsequent career stretched across the entire 19th century through wars and peace, through changing technologies and changing times. She served as flagship of the Mediterranean Squadron, showing the American flag in ports across Europe and demonstrating that the United States was now a power to be respected on the world stage. She served on the African station, helping to suppress the slave trade. In the 1840s, she circumnavigated the globe, carrying the American flag around the world. During the American Civil War, when Constitution was too old for combat service, she served as a training ship for the United States Naval Academy, teaching a new generation of American naval officers aboard the decks where heroes had fought and died. In 1878, she carried American art and industrial products to the Paris Exposition, representing American achievement to the world. Constitution was finally retired from active service in 1881, after 84 years in the United States Navy. She served as a receiving ship, processing new recruits, until 1907, when she was designated a museum ship. But by then, she was in terrible condition, rotted and neglected after decades without proper maintenance, seemingly destined for the scrapyard. And then, once again, the American people saved their ship. In 1905, a congressman had proposed using the historic vessel for target practice, sinking her as a gunnery exercise. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Constitution was not merely a ship. She was a symbol of American courage, American ingenuity, and American achievement. She had humiliated the world's greatest navy. She had proven that Americans could stand toe-to-toe with any nation on earth. She could not be allowed to die. This was not the first time public sentiment had saved Old Ironsides. As early as the 1830s, when she was deemed old, obsolete, and too expensive to maintain, a young Boston poet named Oliver Wendell Holmes had read that she was about to be broken up for salvage. He wrote a poem that captured the nation's heart. "Aye, tear her tattered ensign down. Long has it waved on high, and many an eye has danced to see that banner in the sky." The poem spread across the nation with viral speed, reprinted in newspapers from Boston to New Orleans. The public was outraged at the thought of destroying such a symbol of national glory. Congress relented, and Constitution was saved. Now, nearly a century later, the same pattern repeated. A restoration fund was established. Donations poured in from across the nation. School children contributed their pennies. Veterans of the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, men who had never sailed on Constitution but understood what she represented, gave what they could. The ship underwent extensive restoration between 1927 and 1931, rebuilt to preserve her for future generations. In 1934, Constitution completed a remarkable 3-year tour of the nation, visiting 90 ports along the Atlantic, Gulf, and Pacific coasts. She was towed from port to port, since she had not sailed under her own power for decades. But the crowds that came to see her did not care about such details. They came to touch a legend, to walk the decks where heroes had fought, to connect with a living piece of American history. Millions of Americans made that pilgrimage, and for many, it was the experience of a lifetime. In 1997, on her 200th anniversary, Constitution sailed again. For the first time in 116 years, her crew set her sails and guided her through Boston Harbor under her own power. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the shore to watch. Tears streamed down the faces of veterans and civilians alike as the old ship, restored to something of her former glory, proved that she could still do what she had been built to do. In August 2012, Constitution sailed once more to commemorate the 200th anniversary of her victory over HMS Guerriere. She remains today the oldest commissioned warship still afloat anywhere in the world. She is not a replica. She is not merely a museum, though she functions as one. She is a serving vessel in the United States Navy, fully commissioned and active. Her crew of 75 officers and sailors, all active-duty military personnel, maintains her, offers tours to the public, and participates in ceremonies and special events throughout the year. She is usually docked at Pier 1 of the old Charlestown Navy Yard in Boston, at one end of the famous Freedom Trail. Visitors can walk her decks free of charge and touch the same wood that once deflected British cannonballs. The assignment to serve aboard Constitution is considered special duty, an honor given to sailors who understand the weight of the history they are privileged to protect. When visitors look upon her today, they should understand that the massive guns they see are not the originals. All of the guns currently aboard Constitution are replicas, installed during her 1927 to 1931 restoration. Most were cast in 1930, though 2 carronades on the spar deck were cast as recently as 1983. Hidden within the barrels of the forward long guns on each side is a modern 40mm saluting gun installed during the 1973 to 1976 restoration. These hidden weapons allow Constitution to fire ceremonial salutes on special occasions, the thunder of her guns echoing across Boston Harbor as they once echoed across the North Atlantic. Even with replica guns, the spirit of Old Ironsides remains authentic. The wood beneath visitors' feet is the same live oak that turned aside British shot. The copper sheathing below her waterline was fashioned by Paul Revere's foundry. The ship that sails on special occasions is not a reconstruction but a survivor, maintained and restored but never replaced. So what made Constitution special? Why did this one ship, among all the thousands that have sailed the seas, earn such a place in American memory and American hearts? She was brilliantly designed by a Quaker visionary who understood that if America could not have the largest navy, it must have the best ships. She was superbly built with materials so carefully selected that her hull could withstand punishment that would have destroyed any other frigate in the world. She was commanded by officers who believed, against all evidence and all expectation, that American sailors could defeat the sailors of the Royal Navy. And she was crewed by men who proved that belief was justified. In 1812, the Royal Navy ruled the seas unchallenged. They had crushed every opponent. They had never lost a single ship-frigate duel in more than a decade. They expected the Americans to be easy prey, a brief diversion from more serious matters before they returned to the business of crushing Napoleon. They were wrong. Constitution proved that a new nation had arrived on the world stage. A nation that would not be intimidated. A nation that would not be bullied. A nation that would stand and fight against any odds and win. She did not merely win battles. She announced the arrival of American power to a world that had not taken the young republic seriously. She proved that American design, American materials, American craftsmanship, and American courage were the equal of any in the world. That is why she still matters. That is why she still sails. That is why the American people have saved her, again and again, from destruction. And that is why, more than 200 years after a sailor watched British cannonballs bounce off her sides and shouted those immortal words, she is still known as Old Ironsides. Her sides were never made of iron. They were made of something far stronger. They were made of American live oak and American determination. And they proved in the smoke and thunder of battle that the young American Republic could hold its own against any power on earth. If you find yourself in Boston, go to the Charlestown Navy Yard. Walk across the gangway and step onto those legendary decks. Run your hands along the rails that American sailors gripped as they raced to battle stations. Look up at the rigging that once carried her into combat against the most powerful navy in the world. Feel the history beneath your feet. the weight of all those who served and fought and died aboard her. And remember what she did. Remember that in 1812, when the entire world expected America to be crushed, when British newspapers laughed at American pretensions, when the odds seemed impossible and defeat seemed certain, one ship and her crew sailed out to meet the masters of the sea. And they won. That is the legacy of Old Ironsides. That is why she endures. That is why, as long as America remembers its history and honors those who built it, she will never be forgotten. Her sides are still iron.